I'm going to begin with an anecdote today that I thought was very apropos for today's lessons. A student once asked the anthropologist Margaret Mead what was the earliest sign of civilization in a given culture. Was it a particular utensil, a type of pottery, a fish hook, a grinding stone? And her answer was a healed femur. Femur being this big bone of the leg that goes from the hip down to the knee. Mead explained that no mended bones are found where the law of the jungle, survival of the fittest, prevails. A fractured femur would take at least 6 weeks to heal. During that time, someone else had to do that injured person's hunting and gathering and tend to their needs. The evidence of compassion, according to Margaret Mead, is the first sign of civilization. And I don't think Jesus would have disagreed with her, at least according to the teachings we have today. Compassion, the quality of mercy, comes into both of them. The context in which we learn about compassion is something of a hostile one. The chief priests, the Pharisees, the religious experts are starting to wonder about Jesus and the company he keeps. How he seems to be offering salvation and the kingdom of heaven indiscriminately to just anybody who's willing to ask for forgiveness and enter, believing in him. An expert in the law comes up to Jesus, an expert in religious law, and asks him, "What must I do to inherit eternal life?" It's a good question, actually. It might have the underlying assumption that entry into the kingdom of heaven is based on good works, kind of a formula, certain things you have to do. But Jesus draws him out a little bit more. He answers the question with a question. What does it say in the law? How do you read it? The lawyer answers, actually correctly, love the Lord thy God with all thy heart, with all thy soul, all thy mind, and all thy strength, and thy neighbor as thyself. And Jesus says, basically, bravo, go and do that and you will live. The lawyer has to ask one more question. He has to have the last word, and so he says, who is my neighbor? Now here, the underlying assumption is that a neighbor is one's fellow Jew. It's not a Greek or a Roman, some Gentile, let alone a Samaritan, whom the Israelites regarded as a half-breed. They didn't worship in the same place at the temple. They had different books, holy scriptures than the Jews. So they were almost worse than the rest of the Gentiles. So certainly none of those would be our neighbors. Well, Jesus doesn't attack the man directly. And I take a big lesson from this because I tend to go for the jugular in these discussions, and it always surprises me that people run in the other direction. I should learn that a story, a parable, is sometimes much more effective than that direct head-on approach. Jesus tells this very disarming story that draws us in a way that legalistic wrangling back and forth would never do. And the Samaritan, the total heathen in the Israelites' eyes, ends up being the hero. You know the story. The priest and the Levite are on their way down, following the same road from Jericho to Jerusalem that a poor traveler has taken, and he's been beaten to within an inch of his life and left for dead, robbed, and left to die. Both the priest and the Levite see him from afar and skirt around. They walk on the other side of the road so they don't have to look at this person who's been injured. And I don't know about you, but I've done something similar on certain occasions. I've seen somebody I didn't want to talk to or interact with, and I've gone down another aisle of the grocery store. In Paris, I've seen homeless people because they're much more visible there than they are here. And if it's a drunk that's kind of bellicose, I kind of tiptoe over and pretend I didn't see him. So that's what the priest and the Levite do. They don't want to get involved because seeing up close, taking somebody in with your eyes, gets you involved. If you don't see them, if you don't look them in the eye and really interact, then you're free. You can go on your way. But the Samaritan, the scripture says, not only stopped and saw him, but he went to where he was, saw the damage, and had compassion on him. So he takes his oil and wine and dresses his wounds. He goes to the utmost degree to care for this man. He takes him to an inn, spends the night with him, and makes certain that all of his future care is going to be paid for. Unstinting giving, just like our Heavenly Father. Jesus then finishes the story with a question. Who proved to be a neighbor? He asks the lawyer. And the lawyer can barely bring himself, well, he can't bring himself to say the Samaritan. He certainly couldn't admit that the Samaritan was the merciful one, the one who had compassion and acted as a neighbor. So he simply says, the one who had mercy. It's the kind of mercy and compassion that we're all called to have, and that we can only have through a transforming experience of our cold, hard hearts. The next parable concerns things that are lost. The context, again, is that experts in the law are looking askance at Jesus because he's mingling with all of these people who really he shouldn't be hanging out with. They're the tax collectors and sinners. Who knows what sinners means, but they certainly weren't the people he should have been with. They were people of ill repute. To draw these people in, these people who are so critical and judgmental standing outside, Jesus, again, tells several stories that are very disarming, and they all concern things that are lost. The first concerns a sheep, 1 out of 100 that has wandered away. And if, as I've suggested to you, you are one of those shepherds who saw the nativity scene 30 years before and may have survived to this day, you might just be around in that crowd hearing him tell this parable of a shepherd who rejoices over one sheep that's saved out of 100. And you might begin to wonder, is this the man? Is this the Messiah? Is he the one the angels were talking about? We also learn about 1 drachma coin that out of 10 was lost and is found. It could have been the widow's diary, but in any case, it meant a great deal to her, and she turns over everything in the house to find it. And there's rejoicing in the neighborhood because she found what was lost. And then finally, there's the parable of the son who was lost. Actually, both sons are lost. But one in particular insults his father in a way that is almost unimaginable in that culture, even in this culture. He basically says to his father, I wish you were dead. I want my inheritance now. And he wants to cash in on it. He doesn't only want to continue to live there so that the land can be used together with the entire family estate. He wants to cash in that land and go. And the father allows this. As you know, the son goes off to a far country, and it's only after he reaches rock bottom that he suddenly comes to himself, as the scripture says. He has this moment of recognition that there is mercy and compassion in my home such as I never appreciated before. My father is gracious and generous even to the slaves. So he goes back. And there is a wonderful reconciliation. There's celebrating on the estate as there will be celebration in heaven for the repentant sinner. But Jesus kind of adds a little codicil to this. He implies that these people who are standing around judging very critically, the Pharisees, the Sadducees, the experts at law, are very much like the older brother who stands aside with a critical eye and says, I've been slaving for you all this time, and you've given me nothing. And now this son of yours, not my brother, this son of yours comes back, and you kill the fatted calf, full of bitterness and resentment and this grad grind kind of school of getting ahead. So the challenge is for his audience to understand that the Gentile world is being invited to come into the kingdom. Salvation is wide open. What once was closed off to them now is possible, and there should be rejoicing if any of these Gentiles are coming into the kingdom. But we kind of want a gated community. We don't really want all those folks in heaven, those Gentile people. But Jesus is suggesting we should actually be really happy that they're going to be there. So now we're going to take a look at how artists have, you can take the lights, Jamie, if you would, how they handled these stories. First of all, this is an anonymous picture from the Netherlands. And in some ways, it's not a real success because you can see the background is blued out and the foreground is this bright green. There's no middle distance. So not a beautiful handling of that, but you do have the Good Samaritan here using his oil to heal the wounds, and you have the priest and the Levite going off in the distance. A very different version is the Italian one by Jacopo Bassano. Here you have a better handling of the landscape as you go from a dark and very impressive background here to a middle distance to the bluing out. So the land recedes. You have a beautiful anatomical treatment of the poor Samaritan, which you didn't have in the Netherlandish painting before. The musculature is absolutely correct, and the Italians throughout the Renaissance had been investigating the body, knew it inside out, and it was their great glory to paint it. And here we have the Good Samaritan kind of shouldering him up onto the horse that will take them to the inn. Here's the oil. And Bassano was known also, as much as being a landscape painter, he was known for painting animals. So you have two wonderful dogs down here creeping into the picture. Rembrandt did this image of the Samaritan taking the wounded traveler to the inn very early in his career. We'll move in a little closer. You can see the woman washing at the well. This is the man who's been wounded. Up here, the Samaritan is making arrangements with the innkeeper for this man. And apparently he had a good success. People liked this picture, so he turned it into an engraving. But I want you to spot the deliberate difference. What is going on here? Yes, exactly. It's a dog defecating. And Goethe, the famous German writer and philosopher, talked about this engraving for an entire tome and couldn't bring himself to mention what's going on in the foreground. And I have no idea why Rembrandt did this, if he thought it would sell better, if it was just a touch of humor. I do know that in paintings of the Northern School, you do have kind of bodily functions creeping in. And so it's not totally unusual, but it's just surprising to me that he changed from the original painting 3 years later to this one. I thought you'd enjoy it. Rembrandt again, and this time the Samaritan and the wounded man become almost a pretext for a landscape. Here is the wounded Samaritan on the horse, and several people here with him. And there's a coach and horses out in the distance and a little windmill, but it's mostly all about this storm-tossed sky and the tree. So you would have to read the title, Landscape with the Good Samaritan, to even know that you were meant to look for the Samaritan and the wounded traveler. This is partly because paintings at this time were done in different genres, and a landscape was worth almost nothing. If it were an historical or religious work, or a mythological one, it would be worth much more. That was serious painting, but landscapes and still lives were not considered important. So if you insert something like this, then it takes on a gravity that it lacks otherwise. Rembrandt loved the story and came back to it again and again. This is a night scene with very reduced means, capturing the wounded traveler here. That's his head. I didn't know if you'd be able to see it, kind of tilted back. And the Samaritan, here's the innkeeper, making arrangements here for his stay. But very limited means, just the brown watercolor and some pen and ink to convey a dark night scene. Similar again here, with the Samaritan being lifted off the horse, arrangements being made at the inn. And these would all be very small studies for future work. This is just ink, and I find it stunning that with such slender means, he can evoke the entire scene of the poor wounded traveler with his head bandaged, not able to see, the Good Samaritan making arrangements with the innkeeper, probably the innkeeper's wife here, but just with a few lines, creating an entire scene. This is somewhat later, rarely for Rembrandt. It's dated 1644. You have the Samaritan here with his chin up here. His head is thrust back. And the traveler, I mean, and the Samaritan here administering the oil. So this is the very first part of the parable, but it's the first time that Rembrandt tackles it. He's treated the end of the parable a number of times before this. And again, you may not be able to see his face, but it's right there, head tilted back. You don't see the inn anymore. He's reducing all of the clutter. You just have the essential characters being rendered. And this is his preparatory work. Wynants was essentially a landscape painter, and probably these were painted by one of his students. He didn't do figural work. You see in the distance, the Levite and the priest going away, and you see that the body of the poor traveler almost resembles the tree. It's that knotty, broken off, wounded kind of an object. So he's integrated into the landscape. He's almost part of the broken tree. Fetti, I'm not terribly fond of this, but I give you this because it has something of a history. It's thought that Delacroix, who painted this version of the wounded traveler and the Samaritan, was influenced by this work, that he kind of turned it around, changed it a bit, and this was the result. What we do know is that this picture influenced this artist, Van Gogh, whom we saw last week. This, if you remember, in 1890, Van Gogh was at the end of his life. He was in and out of hospitals and asylums, and therefore he couldn't have access to models or even the outside world. So he took drawings and prints that he had in whatever room he was in. He apparently had a collection of Delacroix's works as well as Millet's. And so he models his image after it. And you can see the difference. I mean, the wonderful brushstrokes. Delacroix is thought of as being very avant-garde with his brushstrokes, but of course, Van Gogh takes it even further. Each object has its own kind of brushstroke. And on the left, you can barely distinguish that this is a human being and this is a human being leaving. The priest and the Levite, but it's much clearer here and here in Van Gogh's work, even though it's more expressionistic. It's actually a clearer narrative. But this is done shortly before Van Gogh will take his own life. So now we go to the sheep, the coin, and the sun. This is an image of the Good Shepherd, of Jesus, finding the one sheep. It's done in 300 AD, which is very, very early for Christian art, when it was still under the Greek influence. Praxiteles was the great Greek sculptor who created things that were somewhat similar to this, so indirectly he influenced this production with the contrapposto, the kind of leaning into the hip, but a really lovely image of the Good Shepherd. There aren't many out there, not many ways of illustrating this. I thought twice about showing you this image to illustrate it. It's Damien Hirst, one of the renegade British artists who came to prominence in the 90s. This is called Away from the Flock, and it is a real sheep in formaldehyde, encased. And it has sold for several $million. Now, I don't know if you put that in your front hall, in your living room, or where exactly you put it, but it is a collectible, apparently. Somebody came in and managed to inject into it black ink and thought that he was improving the piece by creating a black sheep. Hearst didn't agree and sued him, but it's kind of a storied animal. And finally, before we get to the Prodigal Son, we have the lost coin. This is Fethi, who did the one earlier that we saw, the Good Samaritan. And the woman has turned over everything, looked under every bit of cloth and table to find the coin. And she's searching with an oil lamp, which is casting these huge shadows that let you know, in a sense, how important this is to her, how worried she is. This is a looming experience if she doesn't find the coin. So now our first image of the lost son, the prodigal. This is by Albrecht Dürer, the great German engraver and painter. He picks the moment when the young man comes to himself. You can see he's in the midst of all the piglets and the big sows, boars, at his worst. It's the moment when he finally says, "What am I doing here? Why am I in this place?" You can see that all the buildings back here are tumbled down. It's all very symbolic of the environment that he has created for himself. His great contemporary Van Leyden did this engraving, not very large, but incredible usage of the hatching to develop the different planes in the picture and the perspective, a very advanced perspective for the Netherlands at this time. And you have the prodigal here with his father. Off in the distance here, you can see the prodigal when he was with the pigs. And back here in the distance, you can see that the fatted calf is being slain. So the artist tries to incorporate a number of phases of the parable into this. Here, the clothing is being brought out of the house to cover him. And maybe this is the embittered older brother. We don't know. In any case, there are a bunch of onlookers who don't seem to be thrilled that the young man is there. And in fact, the father has done something extraordinary in receiving him back, running out to meet him. In Israel of that time, it was just unthinkable for a pater familias to risk his dignity, to go running off into a field to embrace a son who had basically said, I'm through with you. So it's between the father and the son. Hieronymus Bosch gives us one that's really kind of ambiguous. It's called The Wayfarer, and it may or may not be a prodigal son. We certainly have pigs here. There's a house of ill repute in the background, the man embracing a woman, and a lone woman here maybe waiting for a client who might be the wayfarer, the prodigal. We have a man urinating in the background. I told you that bodily functions can feature mightily in these. And it's ambiguous. We don't know if he's thinking of turning back to go to the house of ill repute, or if he's leaving it to go through this gate and into a better existence. So, as often is the case with Bosch, it's ambiguous. This is a genre scene by Hemison, and it's all the stock characters of a sort of a big party. You get in close to see the prodigal with the woman of the night. And you have the gambler here with his dice. You have the drinker here with his tankard. And you have the procuress. We've decided that we need to have the woman who supplies the prostitutes. And of course, she's made to look incredibly ugly with the tooth missing and wrinkles and not terribly attractive. In the background, you have the prodigal being ushered out in the midst of this very Italianate kind of structure, which is quite peculiar. You have the prodigal coming to himself off in the distance here, and you have his homecoming here. So again, the episodes are compressed into one picture. Von Honthorst was one of the Caravaggisti of that time. He loved the work of Caravaggio, was inspired by it, that chiaroscuro, the dark and the light. So we have the procuress holding a flame, a candle, and it's passing through the glass that the prodigal is holding. And everybody is the prodigal's friend as long as the money doesn't run out. So a very dramatically lit scene. And now we come to Rembrandt. Rembrandt, at this time in 1636, is at the top of his game. He is making tons of money doing society portraits. He has just 2 years before married his wife Saskia, whose face you see here as the woman, and Rembrandt paints himself as the prodigal. And he's kind of in your face about it. He's raising a great big glass and kind of saying, I like the high life. And Rembrandt did. He couldn't keep a penny. He spent so much. He made a ton of money, but he spent it on things, artifacts like this, on canvases, on things like a peacock cake back here, almost unheard of. He was bankrupt by 1654-56. All of his worldly goods had to be sold in subsequent years. And Saskia, who dies in 1642, puts a clause in her will at the end of her life saying that Rembrandt cannot live off the proceeds of her estate, and she was quite wealthy, unless he remains single. He cannot marry, which was a tough one. And he actually took up with several women, and there are long stories there, which I won't go into, but one, Henrika Stoffels, was the second great love of his life. And they lived as a common law couple, but the city fathers didn't take kindly to that. The Painters Guild developed a special rule against this kind of living together, and they tossed him out, tossed Rembrandt out of the Painters Guild, so he could no longer sell paintings under his own name. He had to have his son Titus and Henrika, his common-law wife, sell for him. But he went on producing, and Titus survives until age 27, and he was the love of Rembrandt's life, his only son. When he is married, Titus is able to have one child, and then he dies, a victim of the plague. So Rembrandt is left at the end of his life with only one child, the illegitimate daughter, Cornelia, that he had with his common-law wife. Titus is gone, and the next picture you'll see is the very, very famous image of the prodigal. And this is the last year of Rembrandt's life. It's within the last year. And he's gone from being the prodigal son to knowing what it is to have a homecoming, to fall into God's mercy. It reminded me of this image that we looked at last year of Jacob wrestling with the angel, this tender embrace that you can't help but think the artist feels. He identifies with the prodigal, in a sense, who here has had his head shaved because of head lice. His shoes are in tatters. You have the elder brother here and several others looking on without a great deal of love. But that's compensated for by all of the love that is within this father. Almost, you suspect that he might even be blind, but his touch is what matters. But the brother and the two others, who might even be just images of the brother himself, in a sense, they just look on and judge. The parable is unfinished. It's kind of a ... We don't know what the elder brother finally decides to do. Many commentators have talked about the difference in the two hands, that this looks like a much bigger hand, perhaps a masculine hand, and that this looks like a more frail one, a feminine hand, as if God had a male and a female side embracing the son with his poor shaven head. But incredible tenderness in those old, stiff fingers, and the feet, the tattered shoes. So, a wonderful image of the parable, and images of Rembrandt as he painted himself throughout his life. This is the young man who was cock of the walk, was proud to be the prodigal. Very different technique, very fine technique. You couldn't see the brush strokes, very smooth, almost in the school of Leonardo, but that certainly changes. Here you see almost every brush stroke. You see the canvas coming through. You see the paint laid on, as you do here. And the final image is here. That's the year he died. Actually, it was 69. And here, this old man who almost is laughing at himself. But you can see the wisdom that he has acquired from the sorrow that afflicted him. At least we hope it's wisdom that's acquired. Marvelous book, if you ever have the chance to read it, by Henri Nouwen, The Return of the Prodigal Son. He was drawn to the Hermitage in St. Petersburg just to see this painting, and he spent days in front of it. Jamie and I went this last year to see it ourselves. It's not hung very well. It has reflections coming off it. It's a huge picture, but well worth the detour if you have a chance, and if you don't have a chance, do read the book. This I give you just because Puvis de Chavannes had a great influence on other artists. He was the head of the School of the Beaux-Arts, the fine arts, in Paris. In many institutional settings, you'll see his wall murals. He was well known for that at the Pantheon and elsewhere. So you have the prodigal here with the sheep, or excuse me, with the pigs, and kind of planes of color, more modernistic than we might expect. But Puvis de Chavannes had a great influence on this artist, Auguste Rodin, who gives us this final image of the prodigal, which I think is so poignant. Certainly this is the moment when he comes to himself and reaches out to God and says, I can't do it. It's all over to you, Lord. So there you have it. And this is for next week. Do be here next week, but the week after that, the 2 weeks after that, we won't meet because the church has various other functions going on in here. But that's what we're up to next week. Thank you.